For nearly as long as humans have been around, we've been sharing stories with each other. Whether to pass down knowledge, instill moral values, preserve cultures, or simply entertain, storytelling is one of the oldest traditions we have. It was initially restricted to being an oral practice that would sometimes be spruced up with theatrical gestures and dances until the invention of writing in the early Bronze Age. With the exception of some ancient cultures that used cave paintings, or, like the Aboriginal Australians did, incorporated music into their storytelling practices. Many tales from ye olden times consisted of myths, legends, folk, and fairy tales. But as time has gone on, we've since branched out into things like historical and personal narratives, social commentaries and critiques, propaganda, and other such broader subjects than what we started with. Alongside the ever-expanding types of stories we tell, there has been, of course, an ever-expanding array of ways to tell stories. Nowadays, tales are told through all manner of media. Novels, graphic novels, movies and television, which can be done in live action or the varying styles of animation that exists, or even a combination of the two. Theater, podcasts, video games, tabletop role-playing games, and social media like the TikToks and YouTubes. But no matter how many stories we tell through the many methods at our disposal, a vast majority of them contain narratives or plot points that harken back to the myths and legends we were sharing with each other thousands of years ago. Writer and mythologist Joseph Campbell, for one, was able to recognize many of the patterns in our stories and detailed a formula he called the monomyth, also known as the hero's journey. In regard to the why of storytelling, I mentioned the various purposes they've served, from passing down knowledge and preserving cultures to advertising and propagandizing. But Australian filmmaker George Miller has posited his own feelings on the subject.
We're in a world now where we've got so much information. There's so much data coming at us. We are utterly overwhelmed by it. So you're looking for a signal in the noise. You're looking for something that feels coherent in all that bombardment. And I think we do that through stories. For better or for worse, stories help us find our way through that.
To make sense of the world around us is what humans do. We try our damnedest to wrap our heads around why things happen, and we'll pretty much always come to a conclusion, even if we're wrong. Our perpetual drive to understand, I think, ties into our innate desire for control. We certainly don't like feeling powerless, so perhaps if we can control our narratives, it can, in some way, help us control our fate. As Kurt Vonnegut wrote, tiger got to hunt, bird got to fly, man got to sit and wonder why. Tiger got to sleep, bird got to land, man got to tell himself he understand. And so we go about bringing reason to this often messy world of ours, at least in part, through the stories we tell each other. So it's kind of ironic that during George Miller's attempt to create the fourth entry in the Mad Max series, and do his part in processing the insanity of our world through storytelling, the production was wrought with a similar sense of madness one would associate with this series. That is to say, making this film was a major pain in the ass. To create order from chaos through the act of storytelling, Miller had to do the same while making the explosive, high-octane thrill ride of a movie, Mad Max: Fury Road. This story begins in 1995, when an idea for a new entry in the Mad Max series came to Miller while crossing a street. It had been a decade since the previous film, Beyond Thunderdome, was released to a somewhat lackluster reception. One part of Miller's idea for the new Mad Max installment was that the film would be one long continuous chase, and the other part was that this chase would involve a female road warrior, a sort of counterpart to the series' titular protagonist, Max Rokitansky. For one reason or another, Miller set the idea aside, but the seed he planted proved resilient. 2 years later, while on a flight from Los Angeles to Sydney, that idea popped back up. This time, it started to develop beyond just the basic premise and began to take real shape. And shortly after, Miller got to work properly plotting out this new Mad Max film with Brendan McCarthy. Because of the amount of action and its heavy lean towards visual storytelling with little dialogue, Miller prioritized the reliance on following a storyboard rather than a typical script to fully plan out the movie. 2 years and over 3,500 illustrated panels later, Miller and McCarthy, who had been joined by Peter Pound and Mark Sexton, had put together this new Mad Max story into its first full iteration. But from here, as it so often does for many filmmakers, fortune did not favor this production. Over the next 15 years, Miller and company were practically bombarded with obstacle after obstacle. When scouting for locations to shoot the film at, Namibia was eventually chosen as it best fit the look of the post-apocalyptic wasteland they were going for. The crew then set up a workshop and got started assembling the many modified automobiles the series was known for. The work was upended, however, by none other than 9/11. The terrorist attack tanked the value of the USD against the Australian dollar, which in turn caused Miller and team to lose nearly a quarter of their budget for Fury Road. This setback forced them to not only trash the couple of dozen or so vehicles they had made, but it also resulted in production of the film being halted and shelved entirely. Following this, Miller moved on to other projects like the Happy Feet movies, but was determined to eventually return to Fury Road when he could. During this hiatus, however, Mad Max's lead actor Mel Gibson decided he was tired of having a career in Hollywood for a good 10 or so years and got outed as a piece of shit, which consequently opened up the position for a new actor to take on the role of Max Rokitansky. Miller started talking to Heath Ledger about the possibility of taking the role, but for obvious reasons, that did not work out. Eventually, it went to Tom Hardy, who Miller felt was suitable for the job because he was able to replicate a similar energy Gibson had brought to the character in the previous films. In 2009, a deal had been made with Warner Brothers to get production on Fury Road back up and running, and this time around, they chose to film at Broken Hill, Australia, where Mad Max 2 had been shot. The crew got started putting together new vehicles and began testing out the action sequences to make sure they were viable and safe to do. The cast had been picked, the vehicles made, the action scenes and stunts rehearsed, and right as they were about to start filming, an intense storm hit Broken Hill. The flooding made it impossible to even drive around, let alone film a movie. But even after the storm ended and the flooding subsided, rather than leaving behind the arid desert that was there when it started, the land had been transformed into fields of lush green with an abundance of plant life.
The studio said, we'll wait and see what happens and see if it dries out, but it didn't dry out.
We basically had to put everything back in storage.
Eventually in 2011, the decision was made to return to the original plan of shooting the film in Namibia, and so the cast, crew, and cars all made their way back to the African desert, where production was finally able to begin on June 26, 2012. But even after all this, new problems only continued to present themselves when filming started in July. Shooting the movie in the middle of a vast stretch of an oppressively hot and sandy wasteland, while fitting for the film, came with its obvious challenges. On top of this, because of budgetary restraints, the time they had to film had to be cut down by 40 days, which forced the crew to do a lot of rearranging to squeeze the shoot into its new time frame. This only compounded the stress and anxieties of filming the movie, brought on by all its wild stunts and action sequences. As impressive and admirable as it is to film an action movie practically in the day and age of CGI, a film with as many intense set pieces as Fury Road has proved to be overwhelming for the filmmakers.
The most negative feeling I felt on the film, and it was almost every day, was that sense of anxiety that we were doing big stunts every day. And unless we were really on top of our game, somebody could get hurt, and badly.
As for the actors, they understandably didn't have the most pleasant time spending months filming in the middle of a desert with some pretty harsh conditions, performing exhaustive stunts practically every day. On top of that, at least some of them struggled to fully understand Miller's vision for the movie. The way they shot it led to some confusion as to whether or not enough information would be conveyed to the audience for everything to make sense. Tom Hardy, in particular, expressed that he had a difficult time understanding exactly what Miller was trying to do. This lack of confidence in the director's vision likely made bearing such an arduous shoot that much harder. You wouldn't want to feel like you're going through so much effort and work for nothing. It simply isn't good for morale. Nevertheless, they all trudged along to finish filming the movie.
If you sort of let everyone else's worry and anxieties and indeed panic get in the way of it, you're not going to be able to do your job well. Pay no mind to the thunder and listen to the birds. There's always thunder in life as well, but listen to the birds, listen to the important things.
Production wrapped in December of 2012, and once Miller returned home, he got to work with editor Margaret Sixel, and for the next few months, they thoroughly combed through all the footage they shot and started putting the film together. Throughout 2013, they continued to edit the movie while periodically holding test screenings that had less than stellar reactions because they were watching an unfinished movie, so of course it's not going to make a whole lot of sense or be very good. At the end of the year, they shot the few scenes of the movie that didn't necessarily have to be done in Namibia, which got them the rest of what they needed and allowed Miller and Sixel to put all of the puzzle pieces together to complete the picture. And once the people who had only previously seen fragments got to see the full thing, they realized what Miller was going for.
I suddenly got what George was talking about, actually, because for 7 months, I think the most complicated piece for me, or the most frustrating thing for me, or the hardest part of it, was trying to know what George wanted me to do at any given minute. There was no way that George could have explained what he could see in the sand. And because of the due diligence that was required to make everything safe and to make everything, which is incredibly complex, so simple, and what I saw, which is a relentless barrage of complexities simplified. So my first reaction was, oh my God, I owe George an apology for being so myopic.
Miller took all the seemingly disparate bouts of mindless havoc and vehicular carnage to create a cohesive vision of finding hope and redemption in a world driven to madness, alongside, of course, its fair share of blood-pumping, adrenaline-inducing, beautifully delightful destruction. And finally, Mad Max Fury Road was released in theaters to the public on May 15, 2015, 20 years after Miller first had the idea for it. The movie was very well received by critics and audience members alike, a stark contrast from the earlier test screenings. With Miller's two-decade journey at an end, he moved on to his next project, an adult fairy tale called 3,000 Years of Longing, another movie he had been wanting to make for nearly as long as he had Fury Road in his head. And after that, he decided to return yet again to the world of Mad Max with a prequel to Fury Road, centering around the origins of that female road warrior, Furiosa. There is a fascination with the art of storytelling present in not just Fury Road, but in nearly every Mad Max movie, including Furiosa, and even beyond into some of Miller's other films, like 3,000 Years of Longing and Babe, which he says he decided to write when he read the original story and realized that it followed Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. When he was making the first Mad Max in 1977, Miller's full-time job was working as a doctor at an emergency room in Sydney, where he was exposed to all sorts of injuries and deaths, many of which were the results of car crashes. He has said in interviews that he feels he made Mad Max as a way to process his experiences as a doctor. In terms of film inspiration, beyond being a fan of westerns, action, and road movies, he wanted to follow in the steps of silent films like the ones from Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd, by having his film be told mostly through its visuals rather than being dependent on dialogue. It was in how the film was received by audiences that caused Miller to become more aware of the narrative archetypes that his movie fell into.
The first film did extremely well all around the world, and it was recognized, for instance, in Japan. They saw Max as a kind of lone samurai, and the French critics picked up on it and called it a Western on wheels. And in Scandinavia, he was the lone Viking warrior wandering the wasteland. It seemed to have that sort of universal resonance, and that's when the second film became much more consciously mythological in that sense.
And Miller certainly leaned more into the mythologizing for the sequel. Mad Max 2 is presented to the audience as a tale that a supporting character is telling us of the time from his childhood when the legendary road warrior saved him and his fellow townsfolk from a gang of evildoers. Max's character is incredibly reminiscent of the classic samurai or cowboy figure, like Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name, who is also a lone wanderer. Mad Max 2 tells the story of a stranger coming to a town that is being threatened by a band of baddies, which results in said stranger deciding to help the townspeople defend themselves from the villains. It's a plot that's been seen a time or two, especially in the western and samurai genres. The following movie in the series, Beyond Thunderdome, details another adventure in Max's life as he encounters and deals with a whole new cast of characters in a different part of the wasteland. By then, Miller had established the series' formula of each installment being a different, self-contained escapade Max goes on as he continues to wander in the post-apocalyptic world of Australia. While each movie stands on its own as being episodic in nature, there is a sense of chronology throughout the trilogy. The first movie takes place shortly after civilization starts to come apart, so there is still some law and order like the police force Max is a part of, although it's clearly not doing much good anymore. The second film takes place a few years later when Australia has become a wasteland, and nearly any semblance of our civilization has decayed. The road gangs of the first film have evolved to larger formed groups of marauders, and we start seeing the rise of what will become warlords. The third film jumps ahead about 15 years when the world as we know it is truly and fully gone. Although we're shown that there are attempts at creating new societies, the results are something more medieval. The inclusion of Fury Road in the series, however, throws a pretty big wrench in the established canon. It does follow the pattern of further developing its post-apocalyptic world as things continue to evolve and worsen, but many of its details derail the established timeline from the previous three films. The biggest issue, however, comes from the titular character. Enough time has passed since Beyond Thunderdome that the world and humanity have significantly worsened, but Max himself looks to be in his 30s, which is younger than he would have been in the previous movie, even though decades would have had to have passed since we last saw him. A theory that fans have come up with to explain the inconsistencies with Max's age is that Tom Hardy's Max is not the same as Mel Gibson's, that he's a different character who has taken up the moniker of Max Rokitansky. This idea doesn't exactly work, however, because in the opening narration to Fury Road, Max explicitly tells the audience that he used to be a cop, which wouldn't be possible if he weren't the original Max, because what was left of the police force dissolved sometime between the first and second movies, long before this theoretical new Max would have been born. So that means the Max in Fury Road is likely the same one from the original trilogy. But then that still leaves the issue of his age. If we look at the timeline of the films, the first one likely takes place in the mid-80s, when Max was still a cop. The second movie takes place in the late 80s, and the third in the early 2000s. Based on the prequel comic to Fury Road, it indicates that the fourth film should take place sometime around the 2050s. That means that Max would have to be around 90 years old, so unless he follows an incredible skin routine, the math ain't mathin'. Fury Road clearly ruins any sort of definitive continuity the series had, which was fine with Miller as it solidifies how he'd like us to view these movies, a collection of myths or legends detailing the heroic exploits of the road warrior Max Rokitansky. The tales are malleable, and many details change from story to story, like how legends passed down orally would be changed each time they were told. Yet there are certain details that always remain consistent regarding the mythic hero of these tales. Always a leather jacket wearing wanderer of the wasteland, getting roped into conflicts that invariably lead him to helping those that need help from the tyrannical marauders and warlords that occupy their world. And once he's done his part, he goes on his way to continue his endless journey, never fully finding peace, and always staying in line with his archetype. When making Furiosa a Mad Max saga, Miller wanted to explore a different type of story than the previous films in the series. Unlike the other movies that feature a more basic premise and are smaller in scope, Furiosa is an odyssey, chronicling about 20 years of the titular character's life. Just as the film's subtitle evokes the Icelandic stories and histories which detailed the lives of its subjects and whose scope would often cover multiple generations, this film is very much Furiosa's saga. Miller further plays up the mythologizing of the story when the character known as the History Man chimes in to narrate the last bit of the movie. He informs us that, in-universe, there are differing accounts of what transpires in the story's climax, but that he allegedly knows the truth of the matter and lets us in on it, reinforcing the idea that the narrative of the film is a legend we're being told sometime after the events have taken place. It's clear through his filmography that George Miller has a deep appreciation for storytelling, as well as an understanding of its many tropes, archetypes, and other such patterns. He took that fascination and incorporated it into his work, creating his own spin on familiar narrative and character archetypes, doing his part in helping process our world through story his way. There's a reason we as a species have been telling each other stories for nearly as long as we've existed, and will almost assuredly continue to do so until the day we're gone. We need to understand what the hell is going on around us, to make sense of all the noise, to help us drown out the thunder and listen to the birds.